the next two videos, I will introduce some general ideas about history. What is history? Why do we need it? What do we want from history? What many, probably most of us, want from history are, first and foremost, illuminating accounts of significant aspects of the past. Ideally, such accounts would explain, describe, reveal meaningful episodes by telling us what happened, why it happened, and what it means that certain events happened. We should want such accounts from historians because we want to understand the past, and because figuring out what, why, and what it means is central to what understanding the past involves. We should want them from historians because trained historians are better qualified than anyone else to provide such accounts. But why do we want to understand the past? Partly for practical reasons. Understanding the past helps us to act in the present and to plan for the future. But also for what might be called existential reasons. We want to understand the past because it provides a context for our identities, for understanding who we are. For a very long time, religion has offered the sort of context that people need in seeking of their identities. But increasingly, many people no longer find religious answers credible. Such people turn to science and history to learn about what might make them what they are. From scientists, they learn about the universe and its laws. For instance, in place of the children of God story, secular people learn that we are products of evolutionary processes that push blindly forward, with no provision of the ends to which they will contribute. From historians, they learn, among other things, of the origins and development of the ethnic and national groupings to which they and others belong. What makes science and history reliable sources of information is a shared commitment that acknowledges the obligation to back up one's account with public evidence and that encourages rational criticism. Approaches to understanding the past of the sorts practiced by secular historians are, in a broad sense of the word science, scientific approaches to understanding the past. These are characterized by a commitment to back up theories with evidence and a certain openness to rational criticism. So historians have a professional obligation to back up their account with evidence and to welcome rational criticism. How does something to which we have direct access in the present become evidence for an account in the past? Or otherwise put, how does data become evidence? And more importantly, how does data become evidence in history? Is it different in the case of history than in the case of other empirical sciences? In historical studies, the most important way that data become evidence for an account of the past is by their being causally explained by the account. What I mean is that when history provides supported accounts of the past, these accounts, if true, would causally explain something that exists in the present. This activity of making up accounts or stories that best explain evidential data is called inference to the best explanation, or abduction. Inference to the best explanation, or IBE, the same thing as abduction. This practice is widespread in empirical sciences, but it's central to historical studies. There are criteria for good abductive arguments. The more data explained by an explanation, the better. So this is the property of consilience. Also, the fewer auxiliary hypotheses necessary to make an explanation work, the better. This is the property of simplicity. then the more similar an explanation is to other explanations known to be true, the better. This is the property of analogicality. Also, explanation in which causes are posited on the basis of effects should be preferred, since they tend to be more reliable than those in which effects are posited on the basis of causes. This is a so-called effect-to-cause directedness. These are very general abstract properties that good abductive arguments tend to have. These criteria apply to good abductive arguments in history as well as elsewhere, but we should keep in mind that abduction is not infallible. One must always make it clear which parts of the abductive argument should be counted as facts and which as speculation. Revising abductive arguments and their conclusion doesn't mean that one must fall in the quicksand of relativism and doubt all historical accounts, but avoiding to justify one's inferences with respect to some part of the past might do so. So even if abduction is fallible, and even if historians have to revise their abductive accounts of certain specific or general events, that doesn't mean that all historical explanation goes, or that no historical explanation, no historical narrative is true. If there is more than one correct account of a particular historical event, something that happened in the past, this raises the question of how cohesive or unified is the discipline of history. How unified has it been in the past? How unified is it now? How unified is it likely to be in the future? Also, a more normative question is, how unified should historians strive to make the discipline of history? How unified or cohesive should history be? This is a harder question than the descriptive questions, how unified or cohesive the discipline of history has been in the past, or is it in the present. Fragmentation or lack of disciplinary unity or lack of consensus are symptomatic of the increasing disciplinary diversity in historical studies. So nowadays we see a lot of fragmentation or lack of disciplinary unity in the historical studies. This greater diversity shows up in historians' lack of commitment to such thing as a dominant style of historical interpretation or to a particular methodological approach, and to a shared view about what they are or should be doing. All else being equal, historians ought to welcome interpretational and methodological diversity. The alternative, has been claimed, is exclusionary in a bad way. So fragmentation is welcomed by many practicing historians because the alternative, a unified history, is viewed as being exclusionary. Do you agree with this statement? We'll return to this question in a moment. But we should also keep in mind that this welcoming of pluralism or fragmentation in the discipline of history does not imply that anything goes. Far from it, historical work should be well supported by evidence and evaluated on the basis of serious critical standards. Remember that what we characterize as being a scientific approach to history should welcome rational criticism and should also make clear which data count as evidence in support of which abductive account. But that is compatible with the fact that in historical studies, everything does not have to go in the same direction or in the same ways. So-called disciplinary unity, at least among practicing historians today, is not only a thing of the past, but something they are thought to be better off without. This hasn't been always the case. The idea that a grand historical narrative is available and possible has been something that many historians have held on to for a long time in the past. Once professional history made its appearance, the dominant view was that such a grand narrative exists, but can be told only in the future after more research has been done. So in a first stage, people thought there is a grand historical narrative to be told. We just need to wait for all the evidence to be gathered. In the second wave of history after the First World War, historians became more distant in their commitment to a grand narrative. So there was less commitment to this idea that there is only one unified story to be told about the past. They still continue to believe that one exists, but doubt that it actually can be told in the future. More recently, an increasing dominant view rejects the grand narrative entirely. The key idea driving this last attitude is that disciplinary unification tends to exclude legitimate interests and approaches. So in the words of historian Al McGill, all calls for synthesis are attempts to impose an interpretation. He claimed that integration is impossible except through force or forgetfulness, and in consequence it is not to be desired. Unity on the substantive level, he claims, is provided by telling a single story, but telling a single story can only exclude. Likewise, when disciplines become fragmented and when the crosscuts between them begin to take on a life of their own, unity on the broad methodological level is undetermined. According to this view, the question to ask of a historian are whether the issues he or she is addressing are interesting and being dealt with well. Do you think that this attitude is damaging to the scientific image of history or to its claim to objectivity? If so, in which sense? How would you respond to the exclusionary argument associated with the idea of a grand historical narrative? Do you think that unifying different accounts of different parts of the past means that certain perspectives must be excluded?